Good morning. Giving all praise to God, honor to my dear sister, Pastor Tracy Blackman, to all of the ministers and lay leaders who serve Christ the King, and to you, my brothers and sisters in Christ and creation. It is good for us to gather on the screens, if not in the sanctuary, to praise and give glory to our God. I'm particularly honored to be with you on this Father's Day and this 155th commemoration of Juneteenth, Freedom Weekend, if you will, in the midst of a freedom movement. But there is a word from the Lord. I invite you to join me in your prayers and your grace as we go to the scriptures. Genesis chapter 21, verses 8 through 21 will provide the grounding for our time together. Genesis chapter 21, verses 8 through 21. I read for your hearing from the New Revised Standard Version of the text. The child grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. But Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, playing with her son Isaac. So she said to Abraham, "Cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not inherit along with my son Isaac." The matter was very distressing to Abraham on account of his son. But God said to Abraham, "Do not be distressed because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you. For it is through Isaac that offspring shall be named for you. As for the son of the slave woman, I will make a nation of him also, because he is your offspring." So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder along with the child, and sent her away. And she departed and wandered about in the wilderness of Beersheba. When the water and the skin was gone, she cast the child under one of the bushes. Then she went and sat down opposite him a good way off, about the distance of a bow shot. "For," she said, "do not let me look on the death of a child." And as she sat opposite him, she lifted up her voice and wept. And God heard the voice of the boy. And the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What troubles you, Hagar? Do not be afraid, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Come, lift up the boy, hold him fast in your hand, for I will make a great nation of him." Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. She went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. God was with the boy, and he grew up. He lived in the wilderness and became an expert with the bow. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother got a wife for him from the land of Egypt. So ends the reading, and so reads the word of the Lord. I do believe it to be true. The grass withers and the flower thereof shall fade away, but the word of our Lord shall last forever. For the time that we have together today, I'd like to talk about fatherhood and freedom, of fatherhood and freedom. The weekend of my birthday in August of 2018, here in this building, the Deaconess Center for Child Wellbeing, just behind this wall in the Justice Community Room, I was in a corner near the window when my friend Gregory Ellison raised a question for those of us who were gathered in the room. He was here leading 2 days of fearless dialogues in our community, seeking to center the critical questions for us in being community so that we might hear, see, and change the world. In order that we might be sensitive to the realities in other people, he invited us to reflect on the time in life when we felt most vulnerable. In that moment, I remembered a time when I was only 3 years old. Actually, it was a joyous time, but it sits in my memory as vulnerability. I lived then in Dallas, Texas, in the southwest side of Dallas, called Oak Cliff in some apartments, an apartment complex called Village Oaks. And just up the street from the apartments was a corner store. And at that corner store, I had the occasion one day to visit with my father, Smokey Wydell Maps. So there, when I was 3 years old, took me to the corner store. And there at the corner store, he bought me a 3-liter, yes, 3-liter lemon lime soda. He told me I could have whatever I want. So he bought me several, about 5 different chocolate candy bars. And he bought me, maybe because he knew I would be reflecting on this on Juneteenth weekend, he bought me, because I asked for it, a watermelon. Now I'm 3 years old. I asked for a watermelon, a 3-liter soda, and 5 candy bars, and he gave them to me. I was feeling good. And then he told me goodbye, walked me back to the apartment where I live with my mother and my siblings. And that was the last time I ever saw him. I don't think of him a whole lot, quite frankly, and I hadn't over the years. I've lived 40 years of life without him, and not until that happened a couple of years ago did I ask my mother if she had ever heard from him, heard about him, had a sense of whether he was still alive. I quite frankly don't know why I never asked. It never became a really big thing for me. But when I was asked about the time in life when I felt most vulnerable, I remembered the last time I saw him. And maybe it wasn't as much about that moment as it has been about every moment since. I was vulnerable. Vulnerable at about the same age that Isaac was after he had been weaned and was being celebrated in the text by his father Abraham. Vulnerable, not worrying about, wondering about, or even knowledgeable about the family dynamics that are going on around me, going on around Isaac. He had no idea of the drama that Abraham created for himself when he decided to engage, to take up God's mantle for God's self and give himself a child by being with Hagar. He had no idea that Sarah was also engaged in that kind of conspiratorial engagement to try to make what God needs to do, fulfill God's promise. He had no idea of what was going on in the distinction between a slave son and a freed son, a slave mama and a free mama. He had no idea. He was living in the context of the household. Because you know the ancient Near East, and I know everybody at Christ the King knows the Bible. Y'all understand that the household, the family, if you will, was made up in this ancient Near Eastern context of everybody who lived there. Quite frankly, it didn't just have one nuclear family, but several what we would call nuclear families actually gathered together to be one house. That those who had biological lineage and those who served in the place were all considered a part of the household. So Isaac didn't know any better, and he was at the whims of all of his grown-ups around him to make sure that he had everything that he needed. He was vulnerable, had just been weaned. But so was Isaac, teenagery kind of figure that he was, having come back to the home, the household with Hagar, now finding himself at about 17 years old, was coming to the point of all teenagers where he probably thought he knew everything, but didn't have responsibility for anything. But he was coming to that point because in these same conventions, he was reaching the age where Abraham was either going to have to fully claim him and give him inheritance, or liberate and free him out of the household. So in the vulnerable position where he finds himself, where all of his life is leaning on the decision and choice that Abraham is about to make, he is playing with his little brother Isaac, who all of his decisions, because he hadn't even figured out how to pull together full sentences, everything in his existence is reliant upon these grown-ups who are dealing with their own drama as well. These vulnerable children approximate the position of the children in America today. children wrestling with poverty, pandemics, and protests in the streets. 1 in 5 American children living in poverty. 2 in 5 black and brown children, Hispanic children, who are 10 times more likely to live in food insecure households than their white counterparts. Young people dealing with Kawasaki disease that comes up out of the same spirit of the viral agent we were wrestling with called COVID-19. Children trying to figure out what these protests in the streets are about, except for the fact that they know that mama and daddy are really upset, and something about America seems to be off kilter. Children vulnerable in this moment, trying to figure out what's going on. And if they are boy children like me and like Isaac and like Ishmael, also vulnerable in America to being caught up in what Bell Hooks calls on one side plantation patriarchy, where they learn to be dominant figures using their bodies as weapons to oppress women even in their youth, or on the other side being given to soul murder, being fixed into a frame of what it means to be masculine and having your ideas crushed if you don't fit that frame. The psychological impact that can come from grown folks who haven't figured their own stuff out. Vulnerable children, me, Isaac, Ishmael, who ought to live in hope, health, and wholeness that God has in God's hands for all God's children. The question becomes, how on a Freedom Weekend, how on a Father's Day shall we hold out hope for vulnerable children? And I think the only answer I can see in the context of the text, because I can't figure out the answer when I go to my own mind, is fathering for freedom. Got to engage in a project of fathering for freedom in response to their needs. But if we will do this in response to their needs, I want to argue today that we have to know children's needs. First, I want to deal with Isaac. Isaac here needs preservation. Like all children, Isaac needs preservation. He finds himself early on in life not knowing what to do for himself. And we hear Sarah, who is concerned about preserving what she believes is coming to him. She is concerned about making sure that what he has coming to him is not divided between him and anyone else. She knows that he has a life that is worth saving, and he has a future where he may be called to serve, but he needs first to be preserved. Our young people, all of them, as we find them in community, need to be preserved, held in a space and place whereby they may come to experience nurture and culture until they hear God's call. Preserve those early on in life who don't recognize the realities of the drama that's going on around them, but need someone to take them into their arms and into their hands to make good decisions on their behalf, so that even if they have not been fully actualized in the moment, they can be held until the day that God has it to be revealed. Our children need to be preserved. If we will lead for liberation and father for freedom, if we will parent for them to have prosperity in life, then they have to first be preserved. Preservation of our children means making decisions in their best interest, and sometimes it will mean having to let go some things that we would like to hold close. Abraham deals with the distress of the situation and the drama that he has placed himself in, but rather than deal only with his own stuff, and rather than making decisions that he would like, and rather than keeping himself comfortable, he dives into the distress of his own drama and makes the difficult decision, after hearing from God, that he actually has to preserve Isaac by releasing Ishmael. I know this is a hard story. This has some stuff that's real life, some real life. Some of us who don't come up in nuclear families, some of us who grew up with a stepdaddy or two, some of us who understood a situation when we didn't know our fathers, have dealt with some real life stuff like this. When I finally asked my mother about Smokey Waddell maps, I came to realize that it wasn't the case only that Smokey Waddell maps actually left my mama. It came to a point where my mother charged him to make a decision because she didn't believe he was the best thing for me. Because she didn't believe he was the best thing for me, she dealt with the distress and the difficulty of recognizing that I would experience separation, and there were some things I may experience as loss, but it was better for him not to be around if he was going to bring the trauma he was bringing than for him to be around and actually have a negative impact on my life. Abraham is faced with the reality that he is going to have to give something up in order to preserve his child. And if we will Father for Freedom, we've got to know that Isaac needs preservation. But Isaac's not there by himself. Isaac needs preservation, but Ishmael needs prosperity. Ishmael needs prosperity. We have come to this point where we can deal with what's going on in the text itself, but we also realize that because Ishmael is projected in the text to be between 17 and 19 years old, he is also at a point where Abraham is going to have to make a decision. Either you're going to fully claim this boy and give him that which is his because he is coming into his appropriate age, or you're going to release him from the household so that he may pursue whatever God has for him. And maybe what's going on is not the trickeration of grown folks around him, but rather God working out a situation where he might be cut free, liberated to go be who he has been called to be. He doesn't learn to use the bow in the context of the urbane household of Abraham. He learns to use the bow by being out there in the wilderness. Abraham must claim him for himself as his son, or he must free him to pursue his calling, which he can only find in the wilderness. Ishmael needs prosperity. How do we understand it? We understand it by this. We don't raise these children to be with us. We rather raise them to find themselves and their call that God has for them in the world. And so what we find here is Ishmael, through an act that seems difficult, and an act that seems separative, and an act that seems rude and wrong in the context of Abraham, Sarah, and Hagar, is actually God working to give him the space and place to become all that he needs to be. I know that's hard, so let me put it like this. Sometimes we come to a place and maybe we have found ourselves to call the question in American history right now. Either you will fully claim that Africans who have been made into Americans are fully human and fully citizens in these yet to be United States of America, or you will give us free and we will make our calling in another space, in another place, and in another way. Maybe it will call for us wrestling through the realities of wilderness in order to find our true selves, and maybe there we find the prosperity that we've been fighting for so long in these United States of America. Here Ishmael is God's child who needs freedom, who needs prosperity. Because if he had stayed there in that household, he'd been wrestling with the drama between his mama, his stepmama, and his daddy all his life. And here he comes, able to make a name and a home for himself with his kindred in Egypt. Yes, our children need preservation. Isaac needed that. Our children need prosperity. Ishmael needed that. But our children also need provision. Fathering for Freedom cares for that. Isaac needed the provision of the household because he was still yet weaning and needed to be there in order to be preserved. Ishmael needed provision along the road. He got to a point where the water ran out. God, through the angel, spoke to his mother and told her where to find resource for him. And then her eyes were open and she received water at the well. Then they went into the wilderness and he had everything that he needed. The wilderness where she cannot make it on her own before just a few chapters, but he can make it in a position now as a teenager to help out. They both need provision. It's important for us not to get caught up now as we talk about provision. We have been socialized. I have been raised in the same context as many of you to believe that it is the responsibility of the man, the father, to provide, falling guilty, quite frankly, to the same Western picture of what a nuclear family is that Bell Hooks is critiquing in her book, We Real Cool, about black male masculinity. We fall prey to a system that sets us up by telling us that we are here to provide as black men, and then establishes policies by which we cannot provide the resources in our family. We fall prey to a mindset that say that we need to make more money than our wives in order to provide for the family, and we understand provision only through economic means, and that's problematic when the average sister has more education than the average brother. We fall prey to that definition of what provision actually is, that it's all economic and it is not communal, it is not familial, it is not tender, it is not caring, it is not loving, it is not nurturing. And yes, all of our children need provision, but we need to hold the capacity to define provision for ourselves. All our children need provision. So as we wrestle with the realities of what that means, and we lean in to be proximate to their needs in order to come to that definition, and we are wise to make a calculation about what we are best to provide and what the broader family and communal structure is set to provide, so we don't castigate ourselves and separate ourselves from our families. We understand that all our children need provision. And we also understand that in the text, and I'm done, we understand that in the text, it is not Abraham who provides. It is not Hagar who provides. It is not Sarah who provides. It is God, our guide, who provides, fathering us for freedom. I know Father Abraham had many sons, and many sons had Father Abraham, but the text is not about Abraham fathering for freedom. Abraham is an agent of Yahweh's parental initiative. Sarah is an agent of God's parental initiative. Hagar is an agent of God's fathering process. Abraham sometimes falls prey to bad decision making and low relational IQ, kind of like me and you. Abraham sometimes gets himself into drama that he didn't have to be in the first place, kind of like me and you. But God provides a path for all God's children to be preserved, to experience prosperity, and to have each and every one of God's provisions, because God is the one who meets us at our vulnerabilities and makes sure that we can make it to victory. God is the Father who loves all and each and every one of God's children. God is the Father who works through the neighborhood, who works through Big Mama, who works through our aunties, who works through our fathers, who works through our uncles to make sure we have everything that we need. At my most vulnerable point, when Smokey Waddell Maps was not there, there was still Charles Edward Wilson Jr., my older brother, who made sure that I had enough of everything, including some lessons in the neighborhood. When Charles Edward Wilson was not there, my big uncle Maury Turner was there. Youngest uncle, youngest brother of my mother, he was there when he was cut down by the same neighborhood that cut down Charles Edward Wilson through communal violence. My older uncle Darrell, Reverend Darrell Earl Turner, was there, making sure that I had everything that I needed. When he wasn't there, when there were times when he was away or wrestling with his own stuff, the Reverend Donald Turner, my other uncle, was there. When I couldn't get close to him because he moved to Waco, Texas, away from Dallas, Texas, Reverend Kevin Atkins was there, teaching me when I was in high school how to be the young man that I looked up to in him. When Reverend Kevin Atkins wasn't there, Reverend James Gaston was there. And I'm just calling out the brothers. I'm not calling Sister Troy Dunlow. I'm not calling out Sister Gibson. I'm not calling out Sister Gaston, but they were all a part of God's parental project, because God's fathering for my freedom had nothing to do with gender normative lanes for who gets to do what and what sexuality or anatomy looks like. Fatherhood for freedom has to be free in and of itself. Fatherhood for freedom is not about individuality, it's about relationality. Fatherhood for freedom is not about anatomy, it's about care. And I'm so glad that on this weekend when we started celebrating freedom, that we can close out by celebrating fathers. And in the sanctuary of God, we don't have to choose, because we've got one who leads us, who guides us, who cares for us and loves us free. Give us free by giving us the love of God. This is the great grace of celebration for me on Father's Day. This is the gift that I offer you. And I praise God, my Father, who has grown me up through all this community. And I pray the same for you. Amen. In this moment and in this time, the invitation from all God's parental agents, all God's nurturing hands, is to anyone who may be online, in a home, on the street, in a community, who needs a father like I needed one, who needs to know that there is a father who will be with you for 40 years of your life, even beyond the one that you knew 40 years ago, who needs to know that there is a community like Christ the King who's willing to smooth out those rough edges and fill out any gaps that you may think are in your life. But God has given you into community, and God has held community to serve, preserve, protect, and provide for you. If this is you, Christ the King is a remarkable place with remarkable people who would love to love you into even greater life. So I invite you to make my dear friend your pastor, to make this community your loving family, so that God can father, nurture you into freedom. God bless you and God keep you, is my prayer.